Dear listeners, good afternoon. It is great to have the fans of LAMPA and the viewership of Delphi connecting to us. And as part of the LAMPA festival today, we will hold a debate, a dialogue about the future that awaits us after COVID. And I think the formulation of the question is pretty important and pretty interesting. We're not talking about the hardship of COVID as we face it today. We're not talking about the decisions that we have to make during the COVID times. We're talking the time after COVID, because this crisis is very special. We know that it will end. We know that it will end approximately in a year, maybe in a year and a half, but it will be over. But on the other side, we've seen our societies from a different perspective. So today we have great guests, people who will share interesting insights with us. We're also connected with you through a system that allows you to ask questions. But then maybe let's take it step by step. Let me first introduce our guests. I will start with the guests who are virtually connected. Mrs. Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, and today Adjunct Professor in the Trinity College, Dublin. Hello, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Great, great. And then Mr. André Wilkens, Director of European Cultural Foundation in Amsterdam. Mr. Wilkens, can you hear us?
Yes, hello.
Great. And in the studio together with me, Dace Dzenovska, Associate Professor of Anthropology of Migration in University of Oxford. Welcome.
Hello.
And then, dear listeners, people who see us on Facebook or in other media, there is a way you can interact with the discussion that we're going to have in the studio here in Delphi, in Riga. If you connect to an internet portal, slido.com or slido.com, you would have to use keyword future. And if you use the keyword future, you would be able to ask questions, and I can see them here on my computer. But we will also have two polls so that we can test the opinions that we have from you. Maybe before we start the discussion, I will launch the first poll. It's a multiple choice questionnaire. So if you connect to the system right now, you would be able to see 7 questions. And then, which is the greatest future threat of humanity is the general theme, and then you can choose either it's malicious use of technology, or climate change, or expanding gap between rich and poor, global spread of new and even deadlier types of viruses. All of the above, I think, is the first response that we've got. You know, okay, that's pretty logical. And then no threats. I wanted to divide this debate maybe like 3 parts. So one part is about what we would like to happen after the COVID crisis. What are those things that should have happened long time ago, were not able to happen, and something that we as a society, we as the world, would have enough guts to do? Something that was long in waiting, and only the crisis could push us forward. That would be first part of the discussion. And then the second part of the discussion, what are the most challenging things we would have to overcome? And maybe to set the context a bit, if we remember 1986, Ronald Reagan said that the most scary words you can hear is, you know, we are from the government and we want to help. And from that point on, we were decreasing the amount of government in society. But now, with COVID in place, we're not facing something very complex. We're facing a more or less average disease, and we need a lot of government. We need a lot of societal response. So potentially, we are at the end of a cycle, and we're starting a new cycle through this crisis. So this is my first question to the debaters, to the participants. What are those things that were long in waiting, and maybe now, thanks to COVID, we have the guts to do? That's it? Maybe you can start.
Yeah, I have to say that to give myself to think a little bit about this question,
What I was thinking while you were talking, at first I thought about the future more broadly than just in the context of COVID. Maybe we can return to that in a little while. But in terms of COVID, I was thinking actually about the future and democracy. Because the future is not something outside of human practice. It is very much an orientation that shapes what we do today, how we think about today. So the question really about what kind of a future awaits us is a question about what are we to do today. And the future is also quite multiple. You know, we kind of, especially after the end of the Cold War, when the world was initially structured, well, not initially, but during the Cold War, the world was structured between two visions of progress, the Soviet socialist and the Western one. With the end of the Cold War, we sort of saw the disappearance of authoritative futures. There was no one vision, or not even two competing ones, but there was a multiplication of possible futures. And it seemed like, you know, we could all choose to live the kind of future we want to live, and maybe that's why there was also this kind of proliferation of all kinds of clairvoyants and shamans and self-help specialists, you know, to kind of help us guide towards the future that we want. But, you know, we are human communities that need a shared sense of future, and it means that future is also a matter of political contestation. And so this is the question to me, to what extent actually, when you think of the future as a threat, as this discussion does, to what extent is future a democratic thing? Can we, for example, imagine in the context of COVID, or, you know, let's say climate change, let's begin with climate change, can we imagine subjecting competing visions of climate change to democratic debate? Or can we imagine subjecting government regulations and restrictions in the context of COVID to democratic debate? You know, to what extent a people, however we think of it, people, should have a say, let's say, where epidemiology ends and politics begins, or vice versa. So for me, it was actually a very sort of, the crisis really, the COVID crisis brought that into the forefront, that question about, you know, how do we actually decide?
A very interesting thread, right? So how do we define the future in terms of democracy, and then what have we seen from our governments as a response to this crisis? Mrs. Robinson, maybe you can share your perspective. How did you see the governments perform during this crisis? What does it tell us about the future of government?
I think it's an interesting question, because I recall being quite depressed last January because we had started 2020, which was the year where we were supposed to see great ambition to change course on climate and commit to what the scientists told us we have to do, to have zero emissions by 2050 and to reduce by 45% our carbon emissions by 2030. And there was no sign of governments coming up with that ambition. And then we had the total disruption of COVID. It has disrupted everything and affected every country. It is a global pandemic. And I want to come back to some of the lessons from it. But we needed to be disrupted because business as usual was not bringing us to a safe world. And children all over the world in their Fridays for Future were saying to us, please, please change course, listen to the science. So I've been working for almost 20 years now on climate justice, which begins with the injustice of climate change. And briefly, I'd like to outline what I see as being 5 layers of injustice of climate change. And the first layer is that it disproportionately affects the poorest countries, the poorest communities, indigenous peoples, small island states. And actually, that links very much with racial injustice. Secondly, within that, there's the gender dimension, because women have less power, less rights, different social roles, less access to assets and training, etc. And yet they have to put food on the table and be resilient for their communities, go further in the drought for water, and so on. The third layer I've already mentioned, the intergenerational injustice that the children are reminding us of. The fourth layer is a really important one. It is the layer about the injustice of the pathways to development. The industrialized world had a pathway of fossil fuel. And we must honor the workers in fossil fuel, in coal and oil and gas. But now we have to wean ourselves off fossil fuel as rapidly as possible. But think about developing countries. They have to take their people out of poverty. They don't have the space to do it with fossil fuel, or we will have no safe world. But we're not helping them enough to get the clean energy which they want, and the clean technology, and the clean investment, and the clean training, and the clean jobs. And that's an injustice. And then the last one, and probably the most important one in many ways, is the injustice to nature herself. The loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species. So take those 5 layers of injustice of climate change and say we need a climate justice approach. What does COVID teach us? I'll very briefly outline 4 lessons of COVID. First of all, COVID has taught us that human behavior collectively actually matters. This is the only thing protecting us from the pandemic at the moment. It's our willingness to comply with lockdown or social distancing or washing our hands, all the other protocols. And therefore, in the future, as we deal with the climate crisis, we can collectively change our consumer habits. Less consumption, less waste, circular economy, etc. Secondly, government matters. You already made that point, so I won't stress it. I am very pleased that it's women-led governments that are doing better on COVID, but that's probably another story. Thirdly, science matters. And this is really important because we see governments side by side with health experts, telling us what we must do in phases and how we will come out of this. And we need to listen to the climate scientists much, much more than we were doing and have our policies directed by that science. And the last one is more subtle, but it's real. Compassion. We are actually seeing in this crisis much more neighborliness, much more helping those who are suffering more than we are, because the suffering is not equal. And that neighborliness is very necessary. We need a solidarity because we need to leave no one behind, as the 2030 agenda has told us, etc. So basically, we need to have a climate justice approach to the issue which is the most important. I hope in your voting, I haven't seen the result of it, I hope that climate change and degradation came out top. It should, in my view, certainly. And secondly, we need to learn the lessons from COVID, which are very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. Maybe I can follow up with a question. So you're rightly saying that the societies in the world were able to react to COVID in ways that we were not able to react to ecological disaster. We could see that the water in Venice cleaned out in a matter of 2 weeks after the lockdown started. Do you think there is a real risk that we will go, and there is a real risk that we will go to the old habits once the crisis is over? So from political perspective, societal perspective, how do we make sure that this crisis, really becomes a blessing, as you said? How do we make sure that we translate this joint action on COVID to joint action on ecology after it is over?
I think that is the real question, and it's not going to be easy because COVID is very destructive of economies, destructive of health, destructive of lives. There are people suffering terribly. There are children hungry. There are families hungry. There are people in the informal economy who are destitute because they worked for food. And if you don't work, you don't get food. So it's a very real problem. So we will need a leadership, a collective leadership, which I am seeing a little bit, especially in the European Union at the moment. The leadership on the Green New Deal, on the biodiversity strategy, on the farm to fork policy, reforming the common agricultural policy. Lots of real sense, and even more of a link of a respectful nature with the continent of Africa. Europe and Africa have to get their act together. They have to learn from each other, respect each other, and grow together, if I could put it that way, by having the right policies, including on migration.
Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. Let me connect Mr. Wilkens into discussion. Mr. Wilkens, how do you see the politics of post-COVID world? Do we have a chance to substitute one country leadership with collective leadership, as we just discussed, when many countries take a joint role in trying to set the world political stage?
Thank you. Before I come to this, and in many ways I share what Mrs. Robinson just said, also about the surprising to some extent leadership in the European Union. I would like to say actually the COVID crisis, and for me in many ways it also starts in 2016 with Brexit and the election of Trump, has made me and other people a little bit more humble when we talk about the future. So who would have predicted that Brexit happened? Who would have predicted that Trump happened? And who would have predicted that we have COVID-19? Also, many people already knew that the pandemic is likely. The WHO has warned after SARS. We knew that something could be happening. We knew that populists were going stronger. But hardly anyone really predicted these kind of things. And then we were kind of stuck, and we tried to make the best of it. And I think in that sense, it's difficult for me to predict the future, and I don't even want to. What I would say the best we can do, and the best lesson we can learn from COVID-19 and from other crises in the past, and which are coming, is that we can master them better if we stick together. If we have mechanisms which can deal with a big shock to the system, which can work as a collective in terms of solidarity. We have created a thing called the Culture of Solidarity Fund. What we mean by it is not so much an emergency fund, but that we can deal with shocks, with crisis, with COVID and other things better in a culture of solidarity and a culture of cooperation. And in that sense, I don't know exactly even what will happen in the next months. I don't know what will happen at the end of the year. I don't know what will happen next year. I don't know whether the trend to go back to how it was before in terms of tourism, in terms of, there's a big trend that we want to go back to the old normal and not to the new normal. But what I see as a positive, and I'm an optimist, what I see as a positive of this is that we have seen that stable systems, that stable mechanisms, that stable government can deal with these kind of things much better than unstable government, unstable institutions. And that has actually shown off in many ways that Europe is a stable mechanism, even despite all the things which don't work and we can criticize. It actually has managed this process of COVID so far quite well, despite the initial scrambling around, not helping Italy when it could have done, being more forceful at the beginning. But I think it got its mojo back at some point. And I think Europe could be quite proud so far of what we have done. And I see that's possibly the biggest and the most successful legacy of COVID if I look into the future.
So COVID actually made us proud of European Union. This is what you're saying.
We will see. As I said, maybe something happens tomorrow. The next week, as I said, so I'm more humble. I'm more humble when I look at the future. But that Europe pulled itself together and created this 750 billion fund, which is basically Eurobonds. It's basically Eurobonds, and that most European government created something which could be the basis for a basic income, because what we have now in terms of payment to people to deal with a crisis could be seen as an initial basic income. How we deal with the term in terms of digitalization, we all have become experts in digitalization overnight. We're all Zoomers now. It is possible, and Europe has actually acted quite well, despite the initial problems. And I think if we can, and I'm talking it also a little bit up in terms of, sort of trying to create some optimism to be proud of, not only talking negative about things, because sometimes you need a positive reinforcement. And we know the problems in terms of, Europe not always sticking together when you look at things in Poland and Hungary and in France and so on. But in a crisis, actually, it has shown that the mechanism works. And I'm quite optimistic in terms of how we can manage future crises.
Thank you. And maybe if I may, I will move the discussion back into the Delphi studio. A question to Dace. Dace, what do you think we should learn, and what is the impact of this crisis on small countries like ours, countries with, 2 million people, 3 million people? How does it change the dynamic of, our relationship to the bigger world?
Good question. I mean, clearly small countries, the type of forms of governance that emerged in the midst of crisis very much depended on ability to share information, share it quickly, establish networks of, reporting, kind of producing information about the population. Clearly, it's much easier if on a smaller scale. Applications like Up to the COVID or Stop COVID have to work with smaller population sets, and that makes let's say monitoring, I don't want to use the word surveillance, but it is in a way, right? Population surveillance easier and more effective. It's probably, they've made the governance job better. But the smaller countries are also obviously part of an economic system that is global and open. So we do also have to consider those aspects, when do you kind of institutionalize restrictions that close something and when do you open them? And right now, of course, in Latvia, these are the debates that are taking place. But I guess, thinking about the future, and I would say that, there's a lot to be celebrated in terms of how the COVID crisis was handled, but it is also worth thinking about what kind of forms of governance we're institutionalizing, what powers certain institutions of government take on in a kind of a technocratic manner, in a crisis manner, and to what extent they will remain with us once the crisis ends. Although I'm not sure you were so confident that it will end in a year and a half or so, but it also could become a permanent presence. If not this, then another one, right? It is. I sort of have a sense that actually this is with us to stay, which then also raises a question about what forms of governance we're willing to accept in the long term, and think about them already as more, as longer term rather than just kind of emergency measures, right? I mean, I have a colleague who does ethnography in Greece, and in terms of in the context of financial crisis, and who sort of tells the story how Greeks are living the crisis as the new normal, and actually don't know anymore how they would live after the crisis, because there's no after. So I would kind of, I guess, want to sort of also think about some of those things in the long term, especially governance structures and practices.
But I guess overall feeling here in Latvia is that independent of political specter, we are more or less happy with our government, right?
You can imagine what kind of things can be done in such conditions?
Yeah, I think they've done a good job.
If you're a government, right? And you have such a... I just want to be a little provocative here and say that, it's a really good also time for governments to change policy in various ways, right?
And what is the feeling in Ireland, Mrs. Robinson? How do you see that? Are people happy with the way Irish government responded?
I think it's mixed. I think the initial response was quite strong and firm, and now it's got more complicated. We have a new government, which is 3 parties in coalition, and it has, made some mistakes. We lost our European Commissioner because of a golf outing with 80 people at a dinner in the west of Ireland, and that was against our health guidelines. We also lost a Minister for Agriculture because of the same dinner, and so on. So there have been bumps, and there's the beginning of a fracturing of a trust which had been there, which would be regrettable if it becomes worse, because I do agree with the point that small countries have a capacity to deal better. It's interesting, we're watching what's happening in Scotland, what's happening in Northern Ireland, what's happening in Wales, and what's happening in England. And by and large, I think what's happening in England is not so good. The more mistakes are being made, a bigger mass, and also coming late to it and not taking decisions in a way that might have been done. I don't want to be political about this, but just as an overall comment about trying to cope with it. So I would say Ireland is just at that stage. We've opened our schools and we're waiting to see whether there will be a surge, and we're desperately hoping there won't be. And it's at the same time, we have a government that has committed for the first time to genuine climate policies that please me immensely. A Green New Deal and absolutely clean energy, changing dramatically from what we were, which was described by our then Taoiseach, our then Prime Minister in the European Parliament, that we were a laggard on climate change. If people aren't too familiar with the word laggard, it means backward on climate change. And
not the fastest one is the laggard,
so,
right?
I think, going forward, Ireland needs to borrow from André what he said. We need to be humble. But I think we are on the road to endorsing what the European Union wants to do and being a full player in really moving now to a clean energy future and all the jobs that are associated with that.
I want to pick up on the topic that I think André started. What do we think about the change in relationships between the society and technology at large, right? I think, André, you said that, we are all Zoomers now on one side, but on the other side, we do have a flare-up of congressional debates and the process in the United States when they're kind of thinking of breaking up the big monopolies, and then European Union thinking about taxing monopolies. But if we kind of elevate it a bit higher, how do we see the relationship, where technology helps us, where technology should be stopped, where we should change the ways, we interact or we don't interact with technology? That's it. Would you like to start?
I think that the technology really is the same technology helps and potentially hurts us. I mean, that's the kind the most difficult question is that there's no good technology and bad technology. It's technology that can sort of take on a particular form in human hands. We can use the same programs to really help identify contact persons and build models of who is supposed to avoid whom in the context of COVID. But those can also become very sort of surveillance tools. So it's really, I would say that that technology is the same with border technologies. I mean, just moving a little bit outside of the COVID context, right? Well, various kinds of technologies that border guards use in the migration context, they can both help and hurt. And again, it depends on how people use it and who decides how far to take them and how to apply them. And that's, again, a question about democracy, right? I mean, who and how decides how these technologies are to be used? And it's that's why we have, of course, the data protection regulations that, for me as a researcher, I often find them extremely bureaucratic and incredibly just completely paralyzing my actions, right? Because I can't ask anyone a question before asking them, is it okay if I ask them a question? Which, makes sense, but at the same time, it's, it's a big issue, I think.
Andrew, what is your perspective? How should we change our relationship with technology?
I see it for my foundation. Yeah, we had these things, meetings where we said, let's get someone in on video conferencing, and then we said we can't do it because Jan, who's doing this, he is not there, so we can't obviously do this. Now we are all experts. We can get people in and out and deal with all the technology very easily. So I think that is a little. And maybe not too underestimated win from COVID, from this crisis. We can deal with technology, almost all ages, generations, and that is something which will stay with us. And that relates also to the green side of things. We won't be going to any conference anymore just for giving a talk. We might come in like this, and that's okay. But I think it has also shown, and that is something we in our foundation look at already before, is what is Europe's public space, and the European digital public space is actually inhabited by lots of European citizens, but the tools are all non-European and the platforms are all non-European. And we are not, Europe is not a player. We are, the rules are made somewhere else. They are made by private companies, not by public organizations. You mentioned GDPR, that's, I think it's a big step, but that is only a small step if you look at how do we actually form our public space in a digital world. And I see also a possible legacy from this crisis, that we're more aware of the digital public space, what it means, what are the dangers, is it a safe space? For many people, it is not a safe space anymore. And how can we make it a safe space? And how can Europe invest more that we actually could be one of the people, not the laggards in the digital space, but that we actually could be forerunners of how to define a digital public space, how do you make rules, and where do you also invest as a public institution and not only leave it to privates writing algorithms which no one understands, but then which decides how possibly elections are won in the end.
Thank you. And then maybe to follow up on this, I was watching the Senate hearings of the CEOs of Google, Amazon, Facebook. And then the question I had in my mind is that they were asking questions to them about a legislation that they didn't pass. So they were asking why Facebook is not moderating content. And my question was, why didn't you sign a law that Facebook should moderate content, right? So how do you see this kind of debate continuing? Why do you think politicians didn't act and now are asking for answers from the companies? Because all of that could have been legislated.
You ask me?
Yeah, yourself, yeah. Mrs. Robinson, yes?
Well, if I think it's a very good observation. When you started with Ronald Reagan and saying this crisis has shown how important government is, and if it acts well, how appreciated it is, and how it can create a bond with the citizen in such situation. And I think it is absolutely right. I don't want Facebook decide what is good content and what is not. There must be legislation which provide the rules for Facebook to do it or Google to do it. And we have done this, for example, what concerns telecom companies. There are rules for the telecom sectors. We provide licenses for telecoms to operate, and they have to be renewed from time to time. The same for TV and media companies. So I think it's time to do that also now in the digital public sphere, and to regulate platforms, and also to ask them, not only ask them, to force them to pay taxes, and that is actually happening now, and in France and other places, in the UK also. I think we can't let them continue to be free riders.
Thank you. Mrs. Robinson, maybe over to you. Why didn't we legislate the questions that we are asking from them now? Is it really fair on the side of society to be asking, responsibility from Facebook if we could have just written a law and then prescribed certain things?
It seems to me, and I say this as an elder who doesn't understand this world too well, but it seems to me that actually politicians don't really understand the scope and the power of big tech. Yeah. It's beyond. Yeah. And they don't even know how to implement the kind of controls that would be better. We allowed kind of a giant growth to happen. The cliche, too big to fail. It's some dimension of that. Too big to be kind of almost controlled. And it is very, very worrying. And it's very worrying that the tech companies do not take responsibility for the dark spaces, for the misuse, for the conspiracy theories, for the potential abuse of elections, undermining of democracy. So I think we're on the beginning of a really hard debate on this, but we're by no means where we should be. And I would love to see much more robust taking back control over these big tech companies, and as has already been said, taxing them appropriately, etc.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. There was this episode when somebody used the example of vaccination, right? So if there is a post which says that vaccination is bad, and then you take down that post, which is kind of scientific, then there is a significant part of society which objects to, you know, Facebook taking down, for example, these types of posts, right? So if we cannot like really have, if they cannot like really act even on vaccination, what can they act on, right? Because
I do think there's an objective truth when it comes to science. Yeah. You know, we know what is valid and what is conspiracy theory, and I think we just have to be very firm about it.
Okay.
I mean,
okay.
There may be circumstances where people can disagree, of course, or where science is not 100% certain, because that's science. It doesn't deal in total certainties. That's all the complexity of it. But we do know objectively what is, you know, the appropriate science and what is bad conspiracy or bad anti-vaccine, which is terrible for children. I was chair for a number of years of the Gavi administering vaccination for children globally, and it was just awful to see, you know, an outbreak of measles in a country because a rumor had gone abroad that the measles vaccine would somehow be dangerous. And, you know, this is really serious, and we must be firm about the truth of science and uphold that truth.
Yes, but we also face these types of challenges in the West, right? So there are a lot of people in our own countries who believe that vaccination is bad, right? And then to what extent, you know, we should force them to vaccinate, to what extent we should prohibit these types of views to be expressed on Facebook, you know, is a big question. Maybe I wanted to invite our viewers to maybe be a little bit more active with the with the polls. Maybe if our we can show the result of the first poll. We've got only 5 replies, but still, you know, we can. So most of the people said that the greatest future threat is climate change. You know, 40% responded that this is the biggest one, and another 40% said that everything is a big threat. And also, we do have our question channel open, and we are eager to see your questions. Education. How much education or absence of thereof helped us to combat the crisis? How much does the crisis, the COVID situation, show our ability to engage in a fact-based, in a scientific, respectful debate? What have you seen from anthropological point of view?
It's a really good question. It's not a straightforward question. One of my colleagues from King's College London, Carlo Caduff, actually wrote a book about pandemics back when it was the bird flu and other epidemics that were threatening us. And one of his arguments was that once society goes into a mode where it accepts that this is a threat and kind of starts politically preparing for the threat, then it's very hard to actually introduce arguments that are scientifically sound and justified, but that don't quite fit that overall moral and political narrative. So I have to say that it's because already, I suppose, in the way that you're posing the question, I mean, and maybe I'm wrong, but it's sort of, I can, given the debates that have happened around us, the directionality of that question is, have we been able to do the right thing because people, the masses, are able to read and interpret facts the way they should, and then therefore we together can collectively engage in certain kind of action that leads to the proper restrictions and so on and so on. Now, there is actually sound science out there that is raising some of the questions, right? We know this was contested. The Swedish strategy, was different from others. Those arguments are still ongoing. I'm not sure that they've been fully resolved. It is precisely, and also the argument that my colleague made, that this is all what our experts are telling us is based on modeling. And modeling has some serious shortcomings in a number of fronts. So there is it's you know, as Mary Robinson also said, science is not based on certainties. There's a lot of uncertainty. But since certain decisions have to be taken at certain moments, the facts get fixed as political truths, I would say, perhaps more than scientific ones. So it's, I think it showed us that it is that science is precisely, it's a dynamic thing, you know, that actually scientists are trying to kind of understand this in real time, and we're all trying to keep up. And the relationship between science and politics, you know, this is, I think, very interesting, right? I mean, scientists come up with something tomorrow or the next month. They actually might find out something else that changes what we thought today. But in the meantime, the previous kind of finding has already been accepted as political truth, and then it's difficult to change. So I would really, I guess, encourage people to read very widely, you know, and to actually try to include as many. And there is actually, I mean, I suppose there are, of course, conspiracy theories of all kinds around, but there are also, you know, very sound scientific discussions that are, you know, that don't agree with each other necessarily fully. Really? And don't ask me about the epidemiology aspects of it. I can't, you know, lay out the specificity of that, but yeah.
You know, I was pretty fascinated that, you know, at the beginning of this, of the crisis in March, how little did I remember from school about how such a basic thing as spread of virus can occur, and then what should you do? André, how did you see the quality of the debate going on around the crisis? Did we learn to be better with facts? Did we learn to be more rational in the last 6 months? Are we again trusting the experts we hated just, you know, 3-5 years ago?
Oh, it's a good question and a good point. I mean, while my foundation is in Amsterdam, I spent a lot of time during this crisis in Germany, in Berlin, where my family lives. And let's say 3 weeks ago, I would have said, yes, actually it works quite well. People are dealing with the situation quite well. They are quite disciplined and so on and so on. But now you see these demonstrations of people where, you know, it is a very interesting, if you want to say it like this, a group of people coming together, which basically demonstrate against the coronavirus and the measurements taken by the government to get it under control. And there are very strange theories behind it, including that Bill Gates created this to become a world leader and stuff like that is bizarre. And so I would go back to what I said. I'm humble, but on the other hand, I'm optimistic that we can deal with it, because part of it is human. So yesterday I read a nice sentence to describe the situation. It said, everyone is tired of the pandemic and wants the virus to go away, but the virus is not tired of us. And I think that is the situation. We can't wish it away. And we know what works. It's not particularly scientific. Face masks, keeping a distance, not hanging around in large groups, and waiting and using the time to wait until we find a vaccine or a cure. And these are not particularly, it's not particularly technology. It's actually pretty analog. This kind of stuff, but it works, and we have to get through this. So I want to come back to the question of education you asked. I think it is actually very important. I was brought up in East Germany behind the wall, and education meant you had to learn something which was written in a textbook and which usually was justified by Marxism and Leninism. But then I went to study in the UK, and there I was just taught to think for myself and to analyze and to make up my own conclusions. And I think that's the best we can get out of education now. And I think where we have good education system, that works. And that brings me back to the digital. Of course, decades ago, there were a few textbooks, and if you had them, then you knew what was going on and you could refer to it. Now you have the vast space of the internet with so many informations, and it's even more important that you have an education which teaches you to think for yourself, to analyze and draw conclusions. And in that sense, I think education is vital, and the systems and the countries where you have an education system which is also inclusive, not only, I mean, in the US you have a great education system for the elites, but then the education system doesn't cater for everyone. But in Europe, you have a more inclusive, we have problems too, but you have a more inclusive education system. And I think that serves us better in these kind of times of unpredictability.
Yes, look.
It's interesting. I just wanted to make a comment that I think I had the opposite experience of first studying in Latvia, in the Soviet state, and then going study in the US. I actually realized that having the kind of education system that we had in Soviet Latvia taught me to think, in a sense of taught me to be skeptical of the things that I'm told are true. And so actually made me able to be much more effective in that way of thinking when I say arrived in the US and received some kind of, truths about the global history and things like that. So I wouldn't juxtapose these two forms of education quite so starkly.
Yeah, but that's
by the end, it's to learn to think. I mean, how you come to this.
I'm sure you thought before you left Eastern Germany.
That's why.
But that's a very good foray, maybe, into the final part of our dialogue. We have about 10 minutes left. About 40 years ago, we lived in a bipolar world, right? Then we lived in unipolar world. Now we live in multipolar world. So arguably, the world is becoming more like Europe. Europe, which consists of many different countries with many different opinions, many different governments, absence of one taxation system, absence of many things of lots of different sovereignties. What can the world learn from the painful experience that we had of not being really able to combat 2009 crisis, doing a bit better now, and how can we, the Europeans, can we lead the world through our experience of being able to converge on something and disagree on many other things? Sorry for difficult questions, right? But then, Mrs. Robinson, maybe to start with you.
I think that Europe definitely, as a region, has to play its full part in leading as a region. And as I said, I feel that link with Africa is vital. There's an AU-EU summit coming up in October, where I think there will be an opportunity to reframe that relationship at a very fundamental level. It's always been a kind of top-down from Europe to poor Africa. That can't continue. We have to have a more respectful relationship. And then at a time of a lot of populism and nationalism, of a sort of putting the country first and not wanting multilateralism, it's important that Europe would play its role in helping the multilateral approach, which is still vital for peace in our world. I'm very worried about lots of other issues that we haven't really talked about. The nuclear issue, for example. One of my hats at the moment is I'm chair of the elders who were brought together by Nelson Mandela in 2007. Independent global leaders to work for peace and human rights and keep his legacy going. And we brought out a paper a while ago, very worried indeed about the nuclear issue, because we've seen the unraveling of nuclear agreements. We've seen the possibility that the New START, which is the only agreement still existing between the United States and Russia, may not be renewed. The Russians, interestingly, want to renew it, but the Trump administration has not shown that willingness and wants to bring in China in a way that isn't very realistic. And we're fractured by this divide now opening up, in particular between the United States and China. It's kind of almost encouraging the world to say which system do you want to be part of? And I think the EU has an incredibly important role in not being part of that divide, in the sense of knowing its values, standing by those values, but not being under either a United States, if it continues under a Trump administration, which is very dangerous for democracy, I believe, and very dangerous for the values that we have subscribed to in our multilateral world. And equally, China is more aggressive now. So this is not an easy time. It's a very bumpy time for multilateral relations. And we have to be aware that we need to have a good discussion, a good review of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but that could itself be at risk. It was postponed to next year now because of COVID. And you know, when I was young, I marched because of my concern about nuclear issues. I find it extraordinary that people are not more concerned. I mean, you know, talk about education. You know, people should really educate themselves to the risks involved, because it's not just the risk of intentional nuclear war. It's the risk of miscalculation, mistake, etc. And those risks are very real and could be very devastating. And more countries have nuclear weapons, and more countries are trying to have nuclear weapons. So I just mentioned that because we haven't talked about it when we're talking about the future. It's something the elders are very concerned about, as well as climate change and other issues.
Thank you. And then handing over to Mr. Wilkens.
Actually, the last point from Mary Robinson made me a bit worried, because it reminded me of so many people who talked, when everyone talked about climate change and you know, other issues, and some people talked about pandemics in the past. And we said, okay, that maybe is an issue which we can deal with later. And the nuclear issue comes across a bit like that. But basically, I think multilateralism has had a pretty tough time the last 10 years, probably, but particularly the time since 2016. And also the EU had a pretty tough time after the financial crisis and with Brexit. But the EU has a mechanism, they have institutions, and is what I would describe a certain discrete charm of the bureaucracy. It is there. There are institutions which hold when it counts, when there is a crisis. And at the global level, we don't have that. I mean, I haven't heard of the G20 for probably a year or so. I don't know, do they still exist? What is actually happening? The UN, Guterres is a very good guy, but has anything done at this global level? I don't know. WHO is under attack. Probably some things may be true related to the WHO, but I mean, we need institutions like that. But at the EU level, at the European level, we have created institutions which work. And I think, should we advertise them as a model? I think Europe is not necessarily the best to go around telling others, look at our models. I think people should make up their own mind. We have also a lot of issues to deal with ourselves, whether it's polarization in society, the whole issue of Black Lives Matter, colonialization. So we have a lot of issues in Europe, but what happened after the Second World War is, the lesson we have learned is we have to create institutions which force us to work together, which force us to cooperate together, even if it is messy, and even if it takes ages and ages of summits where people sit into the night, and at some point something emerges. And I think we have seen actually a miracle in the last few months, that out of this crisis we have moved a step ahead instead of a step backward, which could have happened.
From that perspective, the presidency of Trump was a blessing because, we all could see what happens if the United States stops leading for whatever reason. And can we organize ourselves without one country being a clear leader? And most probably, if we move, millennia ahead, the future of the world is many strong countries, hopefully, many, rich countries, many successful countries, which would have to find consensus, which would have to agree on policy, which would have to agree on many, many different things, without the help of, one, superpower or two superpowers, dictating more or less the way. What can we learn from groups and human societies from anthropology point of view? Because people have to agree on things, right? People are not in a position when there is like one guy or one lady just, charging ahead.
If they have enough force at their disposal, of course, they can. But I would like to kind of think historically a little bit, since you started your question by kind of taking us through the, bipolar, multipolar, unipolar world, and that's kind of opens up to the question, well, who is to lead whom where, right? And this is exactly sort of, think about it in that same way about the future. Because, for much of the 20th century, the future was something that societies were actively trying to bring about. It was something that was better than the present, right? Mm-hmm. Whether vis-a-vis the socialist revolution or a post-World War II development paradigm, the future was either revolutionary or progressive kind of development, right? Leading us towards more growth, more wealth, more of everything, and generally better than what we were living in the present, right? Things started to change a little bit kind of late 20th century when the term risk society appeared, right? The future had some risks. We needed to mitigate these risks and buy insurance products and other things. But still, the overall frame of kind of movement towards progressive future remained. And now it has changed. Just look at the questions we're posing to the audience today. The future is a threat. The present no longer has to overcome. It has to be protected from the future. And I think this is quite a radical shift in the way we actually think about what needs to be done, who is to do it, who leads whom. It's a really striking way to think. And yet, at a daily, kind of everyday level, we still sort of live as if future was progressive improvement over today, right? We send kids to school, better education we think will lead to better jobs. Economists still draw growth charts that go upward. Even though, and if you saw some growth charts after the crisis, 2008 crisis, it was a deep fall. But then still, it was to go back up, right? So we still kind of think that things eventually improve. But I'm not sure. The overall frame has shifted. Now the future is a threat.
But isn't it like a Buddhist moment that instead of trying to build the future, we start living in the present with all of its threats, with all of these opportunities? Yeah. And
but it can also become a moment of embattlement, right? If people think that they need to protect what they've got, there's a greater chance that groups will start to protect what they've got against each other, against the future, right? If this overarching mentality is one of embattlement and protection, that kind of changes also how humans collaborate. It may produce really sort of powerful forms of collaboration, but it can also produce segregation and separation.
Thank you. Thank you. This happens to be most probably the final comment. We are in the last minute of our dialogue. Thank you to all of the participants. Thank you for dialing in. I really hope that this discussion informed your thinking process. I really hope that we were successful in informing our viewers' thinking process. And let's do our best to prepare ourselves and prepare our societies, our small groups and large groups, to what should happen once the crisis is over, and then we start a post-COVID world. And hopefully we learn from what happened to us during this 12 months, 18 months, we'll see. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.